I want to start by telling you I wasn't looking for this. I think that matters, because so many stories about love later in life get told as though the person went out searching for it, plotting it, hoping for it around every corner. I wasn't. I was 71 years old, 8 years widowed, and the last thing on my mind when I moved to a small town on the shore of Lake Chapala was romance. I was looking for community. I was looking for warmer winters and a slower pace, and a version of my life that didn't feel like I was simply waiting out the rest of it in the same house where my husband and I had raised our children. Love was not on the list. And yet here I am, at 73, telling you about a man named Toms, who has completely rearranged everything I thought I understood about how much of my life was still ahead of me. I should back up. My name is Nancy, and I spent 41 years married to a man named Robert. A good, steady, occasionally maddening man I met at 19 and stayed married to until he died of pancreatic cancer 8 years ago, 6 months from diagnosis to the end, which is its own kind of brutal arithmetic I won't dwell on, except to say that I understand grief. Real grief. The kind that rearranges your furniture and your sense of time both. We raised 3 children outside Charlotte, North Carolina, in a brick colonial I lived in for 36 years, and I spent most of my working life as a school librarian, which, if you've never done it, is a job built almost entirely around helping other people find exactly what they need, often without them fully knowing how to ask for it. Robert and I had the kind of marriage that doesn't make for particularly dramatic storytelling, which I've come to understand, later in life, is actually its own quiet achievement. We disagreed about money more than either of us liked to admit, argued for an entire decade about whether to repaint the kitchen, and stayed married anyway. Through 3 children and 2 recessions and one genuinely terrifying year when Robert Jr. was 15 and testing every boundary a parent has, because underneath all the ordinary friction there was something steady I never once seriously doubted. When he got sick, I sat with him through every appointment, learned more about pancreatic cancer than I ever wanted to know, and held his hand at the end in a hospital room in Charlotte that I can still, 8 years later, describe down to the pattern on the curtains. I tell you all of that not to dwell on the sadness of it, but because I think you need to understand the size of what I thought I'd already had and lost, in order to understand how unprepared I was for anything resembling it to happen again. After Robert died, I stayed in that house for 6 years, mostly, I think now, because leaving it felt like a second kind of losing him. My children worried about me, gently, the way adult children do, checking in with a frequency that told me more about their concern than their words ever did. I filled those 6 years reasonably well, with grandchildren and book clubs and volunteer shifts at the library where I used to work. But there was a particular flatness underneath all of it, a sense that I was managing a life rather than living one, and I don't think I fully admitted that to myself until my youngest, Diane, visited for a weekend and said, gently over coffee, "Mom, when's the last time something surprised you?" I couldn't answer her. That bothered me more than I let on. Looking back, I think those 6 years had a very specific shape to them, one I suspect a lot of widows recognize even if they've never described it quite this way. It wasn't unhappiness exactly. I had good days, real laughter, genuine pleasure in my grandchildren and my garden and my books. But everything sat inside a container that had already been sealed, a life I was living out rather than building, because some part of me had quietly decided that the building phase of my life was finished the day Robert stopped breathing. I went to the same grocery store every week, sat in the same pew at church, had dinner with the same 3 friends on rotation, and told myself this was simply what contentment looked like at my age, rather than admitting it might actually be a very well-organized form of hiding. A friend from my book club, a woman named Peggy who'd moved to Ajijic 4 years earlier and came back to Charlotte twice a year to visit her grandchildren, had been telling me about her life there for ages. In the particular animated way, people talk about a place that's genuinely changed them. I'd always half-listened the way you half-listen to a friend's enthusiasm for something you've quietly decided isn't for you. But that question from Diane sat with me for months, and somewhere in that sitting, Peggy's stories stopped sounding like background noise and started sounding like a door I hadn't tried opening. I visited Ajijic for 2 weeks that spring, stayed with Peggy, and found, almost immediately, the specific thing that had gone missing from my life without my quite noticing its absence, which was simply being around other people who were still actively building something rather than politely managing what remained. Peggy's social calendar at 76 was fuller than mine had been at 50. Book clubs, garden tours, a weekly dominoes game, volunteer shifts at the Lake Chapala Society. I came home from that trip, sold the brick colonial within 4 months, and moved to Ajijic permanently that September, 72 years old, into a small casita 6 blocks from the plaza, with a garden I'd never had the patience for in Charlotte, and apparently had all the patience in the world for here. I met Tom's the following spring, at a garden club meeting I'd started attending, mostly because I'd developed an unexpected, slightly obsessive interest in growing bougainvillea, which does not survive North Carolina winters and, it turns out, thrives almost aggressively in the Ajijic climate. He was leading a session on pruning technique. A widower himself, 74, a retired veterinarian from Guadalajara who'd moved to the lakeshore a decade earlier after his wife, Alma, passed away from a stroke. He had a quiet, unhurried way of explaining things, the kind of patience I recognized immediately from 30 years of watching good teachers work, and I remember thinking, distinctly, that I liked listening to him talk about plants far more than the subject matter alone accounted for. Those garden club Tuesdays became, over the following weeks, the fixed point my whole week seemed to organize itself around, though I didn't let myself examine why for longer than was probably honest. Tom's would linger after the formal session ended, walking the group through individual plots, and somehow always ended up at mine last, offering advice about my bougainvillea that stretched well past anything the plant actually required. I started arriving early. I started staying late. I told myself for weeks that I simply enjoyed the gardening, which was true, and also not remotely the whole truth. I want to be honest that I didn't recognize what was happening for months. I'd built such a firm, comfortable identity around being a widow, around Robert having been the one great love of my life, a category I'd quietly closed the book on somewhere in those 6 flat years in Charlotte, that I genuinely didn't have a framework for what I was feeling when Tom's and I started finding excuses to walk out of garden club together, when I started looking forward to Tuesdays with an intensity that had nothing to do with bougainvillea. It was Peggy over dominoes one evening who finally said what I hadn't let myself say out loud. She looked at me mid-game and said, "Nancy, you've mentioned Tom's 4 times in the last 20 minutes. I hadn't realized. I sat with that for the rest of the evening and lost badly at dominoes, distracted by a feeling I hadn't had reason to name in over 40 years. Peggy, to her credit, didn't push either, though she clearly enjoyed watching me squirm a little over the following weeks. She'd been widowed herself for 6 years by then and had made her own peace, she told me one evening, with never remarrying, content instead with a wide circle of friends and an active calendar that left little room for romance. She wasn't envious of what was building between Tom's and me, exactly, but she was, I think, a little wistful, and she told me plainly, one Sunday over coffee, that whatever I did next, I shouldn't talk myself out of it, purely because it felt inconvenient at 72 to be starting something new. You've already grieved the version of your life where this doesn't happen, she said. You don't owe anyone another few decades of that grief just to prove you were faithful to it. I've turned that sentence over in my mind more times than I could count since, because I think it named something I'd never quite had language for, the strange, unspoken loyalty some of us feel to our own loneliness, as though staying sad were the last gift we could still give someone who's gone. Tom's asked me to dinner not long after, at a small restaurant overlooking the lake, and I said yes before I'd fully worked out how I felt about saying it, and then spent the entire walk home afterward in a state of mild disbelieving shock, 73 years old, replaying a first date in my head like a teenager, which felt absurd and wonderful in almost equal measure. He'd worn a pressed guayabera and brought a single stem of bougainvillea, which he presented with a small, self-deprecating laugh, acknowledging he knew it was a slightly absurd gift for a woman he'd been teaching to garden for months. We talked for 3 hours, about Alma and Robert both, without either of us flinching from the subject, which I've come to believe is one of the clearest signs I've ever encountered that two people are actually ready for each other rather than simply lonely at the same time. I called Diane that night, my youngest, the one who'd asked me when I was last surprised, and told her I'd had dinner with a man. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Mom, that's wonderful," in a voice that told me she meant it completely, no hesitation, no careful management of her own feelings about it, which surprised me more than the date itself had. Not everyone in my life responded quite that simply, and I want to be honest about that too, because I think a lot of women watching this have their own version of this particular complication. My middle child, Robert Jr., named for his father, took longer to come around. He didn't say much directly, but there was a coolness to our calls for a few months, a carefulness around any mention of Tom's, and I understood it, even as it hurt a little, because loving someone new can feel, to the people who love the person you lost, like a kind of quiet erasure of their father, even when it isn't one, even when it was never meant to be. I didn't push him. I remembered, from 30 years in a library helping children find books before they'd fully worked out what they were actually looking for, that some things can't be rushed toward, only walked toward at their own pace. I simply kept living my life honestly and let him find his own way to it, which he eventually did about a year later. Meeting Tom's properly for the first time when he visited Ajicic, and watching the two of us garden together for an entire afternoon before he said quietly over dinner that night, "Dad would have liked him." I cried at the table. Tom's, with the same quiet grace he brings to everything, simply reached over and held my hand, understanding, I think, exactly what that sentence had cost my son to say, and exactly what it meant to me to hear it. My oldest, Susan, back in Charlotte, had a different reaction entirely, calling me almost giddy the week I told her, asking a dozen questions about Tom's I hadn't fully worked out answers to yet myself, and I think, looking back, her enthusiasm and her brother's caution were really two sides of the same love, expressed in whatever language each of them had available to them at the time. Tom's and I have been together for 1.5 years now, and I want to tell you plainly, because I think it matters, that we haven't remarried and don't currently plan to, which surprised some people back in Charlotte more than the relationship itself did. We maintain separate homes, 4 blocks apart, close enough to share most evenings, and far enough that I still wake up most mornings in a house that is entirely, unapologetically my own, tending a garden with plants he taught me to grow, in a life I built for myself before I ever knew he'd be part of it. He comes for dinner most nights, cooks better than I do, which I've made my peace with, and gardens beside me most Sunday mornings, the two of us barely speaking for an hour at a stretch, perfectly comfortable in the quiet, which is its own kind of intimacy I don't think I fully appreciated the first time around, when I was too young to know how rare it is. We've built a rhythm that neither of us planned, but both, I think, needed exactly this shape of. Wednesday evenings, we walk the Malikan along the lake after dinner, watching the light go orange and then pink over the water, a ritual that started by accident the first month we were together and has simply never stopped. He still leads the garden club sessions on Tuesdays, and I still show up early, though we've both stopped pretending that's about the bougainvillea. His daughter Camila, who lives in Guadalajara with her own family, has become something close to a friend over the past year, driving out for the day every few weeks, and the first time she called me by name instead of Nancy, la novia de mi pap. I understood I'd been quietly, gradually absorbed into a family I never expected to be part of again at 73. She brings her 2 young sons on those visits, and I've discovered, somewhat to my own surprise, that I still remember exactly how to keep a 7-year-old entertained in a garden for an entire afternoon, a skill I'd assumed retired along with my library job. My life here costs me around $1,500 a month, the casita, groceries, my share of the garden club dues, occasional dinners out with Tom's at that same restaurant overlooking the lake where he first asked me, comfortably covered by Robert's pension and my own Social Security, with enough left that I helped Diane and her family fly down for 2 weeks last Christmas. The whole family gathered in my small casita garden, Tom's teaching my grandchildren how to properly deadhead roses while my daughter watched, quietly, with an expression I recognized as something close to relief. I think about that question Diane asked me over coffee in Charlotte more than almost anything else from that whole difficult season of my life. When's the last time something surprised you? I couldn't answer her then. I can answer her now, easily, because my life here is full of small, ongoing surprises, a new bloom in the garden, a word in Spanish I finally use correctly without thinking about it first, a man who, at 74, still occasionally shows up at my door with flowers for no particular occasion, simply because he felt like it. I've thought a great deal over this past 1.5 years about the particular fear so many of us carry into our 70s, the quiet assumption that whatever door closed with the loss of a spouse simply stays closed, that romance becomes, past a certain point, a category reserved for the young or the lucky or the people in movies, not for women like me. Standing in a garden in comfortable shoes with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair. I carried that assumption for 8 years without ever fully examining it, and I think I might have carried it for 8 more if Diane hadn't asked me that question, and if Peggy hadn't kept gently, persistently inviting me into a life bigger than the one I'd allowed myself. If any of you are sitting with that same quiet assumption that this particular door has already closed for you, I want you to comment below and tell me about it, because I read every single one, and I think a great many of us have decided something is finished simply because we've never actually tested whether it is. I didn't come to a Gijik looking for Toms. I came looking for a version of my own life I could still be surprised by, and I found both, which I've come to understand were never really separate things at all. I was 73 years old, sure that the great love story of my life had already happened and ended, and I want to tell you that I wasn't wrong about Robert, not for one moment. What I was wrong about was the idea that a life only has room for one. Tom's doesn't replace what I had with Robert, and he's never once asked me to pretend otherwise. There's a framed photograph of Robert on my bedside table that Tom's dusts without comment whenever he's tidying up, the same unhurried care he brings to everything, and I think that's small. Ordinary gesture has told me more about the kind of man he is than almost anything else he's ever said. He simply showed up patiently the way he explains pruning technique and made room for something new to grow in a garden I thought I'd already finished planting. I'm Nancy Franklin. Thank you for listening to Women Choose Mexico.